Hello, everyone. Welcome to another special webinar session with Normative. My name is Siddharthan, and I will be hosting our session today. We'll be covering quite a hot topic that's been growing in prevalence within the higher education sector, and that is how to move on from spend-based carbon accounting, with particular focus on the HESCET methodology. Just a couple of housekeeping comments and points. This webinar will last approximately half an hour. It's being recorded and it will be available on demand. And also there is a questions feature at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please submit your questions and hopefully we can answer them during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Our speakers today, I'm excited to be joined by two members of our climate strategy team, Johnny and Dimitris. Johnny, Dimitris, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Johnny McCreesh, and I'm a team lead in the climate strategy team. So I've been working in carbon accounting for the last 5 years. I work with a wide variety of organizations from around the world, quite a lot in Europe, UK, and North America. Together with Dimitri, we've been working with some higher education establishments as well. Dimitri.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dimitris Stoidis, Climate Strategy Advisor at Normative. Work with a variety of different customers, both higher education, but also finance, supporting from data gathering all the way to how we can use this data to support regulations and all reductions, net zero, and other various subjects. And excited to share some insights on our work on higher education and how you can benefit from Normative. I'll give it back to Sue to the studio to get us started with the agenda.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. So for the agenda for today, I will cover just a couple of slides on the brief introduction into Normative. The team will then cover a case study that highlights just how Normative compares with the HESCET methodology. Then we're going to talk about, in general, how Normative supports the higher education sector, just before we finish off with the Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, so about Normative. So Normative, sorry, Dimitris, if you could just go next slide. Thanks. So Normative has been founded on scientific knowledge more than 10 years ago. As the pioneer in the carbon accounting space, it was way ahead of its time, dealing with the challenges of convincing and motivating organizations to measure, roadmap, and reduce their carbon emissions. But today, Normative has grown into an organization with over 160 climate professionals at your service, and it's become a market leader in the space as well. It's supported by a number of investors with over 50 million euros, with key investors across the climate tech space. And on the next slide, we have the market leadership. So we are highly recognized by key analysts in our space. There's IDC, Vedantix, just to name a few, along with the other players. We have quite a illustrious Rolodex of customers that we've been serving for the last 10, 12 years. Everyone, I think, industries and semi leaders across the board, from manufacturing to professional services, finance, retail, and hospitality, all have been supported by Normative to measure and meet their net zero goals. Johnny, with that, I leave the floor to you.
The scientific integrity in the work that Normative does, it's really central to our work today. It means a lot to people like Dimitri and myself working in climate strategy that the methodology is solid and that we're really proud and confident to talk about the data that Normative reports. To do this, we contribute to a lot of leading standards and policy across the world. Our founder, Christian, is part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol working groups that we're really excited to see the Scope 3 technical working group releasing data at the moment. We also have key partnerships with some players like CDP, EcoVadis, and others that you can see listed here on the screen. We're really proud to have our SBTi targets validated ourselves as Normative, and we're really keen to share transparency in the methodology that we talk about today. So we're talking today about our support for higher education. Here, we want to highlight some of the key areas that we think are important for higher education establishments, universities across the UK. We think that we can help you progress your data collection, exploring the full potential of the greenhouse gas protocol. So looking beyond spend data, and we're going to talk in a few slides about what that means exactly. Doing this allows you to be really confident in the data that you're sharing, making sure that it's accurate and credible, and you avoid intentional or unintentional greenwashing. And I think unintentional greenwashing is the most common that we see within the industry. And then finally, we're really aware that within higher education in the UK, there are some specific reporting requirements that are required. And so we've built our taxonomy and built our system to allow easy reporting, to make this just as easy as using HESCET as well. So when we're looking at normative, and we're going to compare now some of the methodologies that are used by HESCET and those used by normative. And so at the beginning, and both methodologies rely on spend-based estimations. This is perfectly acceptable under the greenhouse gas protocol, and it's a really great place for organizations to start. What this means is you're looking at an extract of all of the purchases that your organization has carried out in the last year. So all of the different activities, products, services that you've purchased. Once you've got that data, you put it through a model, either HESCET or normative in this case. And these are EEIO economic models. And it allows you to come up with an estimate of what is the climate impact of all of these activities. It's based on the amount of money that you've spent. It's good for a hotspot analysis as a first step. But what we found is HESCET stops here. It stops at the spend-based estimate, whereas normative continues on, following the greenhouse gas protocol's guidance for improving data quality. We can see here in the chart, we move up to activity data, supplier data, and product level data. This is what normative will allow you to do. Currently with the HESCET model, you're finishing at the spend-based assessment. There's a number of issues related to this. Notably, the only way to reduce your emissions is to reduce your spending. Whereas with normative, as you move up the chart, you start to get into activity data, supplier data. You can start to compare different suppliers with each other and start to select products based on their climate impact. So we're going to dive in a little bit deeper now and look at some of the differences between HESCET and normative. On this spreadsheet, I'm going to talk you through from top to bottom. The model type used by HESCET is a spreadsheet. It's a static spreadsheet model that is updated on the internet. You download the spreadsheet, and then that's what you use. Normative, on the other hand, is an algorithmic engine that's extremely powerful. We see that in the number of emissions factors that are listed as well. So whereas HESCET has one main database with around 311 emissions factors, normative, on the other hand, has over 17 main core databases. And this adds up to over 325,000 emission factor variants. Just this month, we're about to release another 20 to 25,000 emissions factors in our databases. When we look at geographic coverage, we can see that HESCET has universal factors. So the single factor that you apply within HESCET will apply to all goods and services, no matter where they're purchased from. Normative, on the other hand, has regional and country-specific adjustments. So you can tell the difference between a product purchased in the UK or Norway versus one purchased from China or Indonesia. Next, and really crucial when we go on to talk about spend, there is no inflation adjustment with HESCET. Within normative, we look at the data and the amount of money that you've spent with a product, and we adjust it for inflation. As everyone knows, in the last few years, we've seen extremely high inflation across the world. In some industries, this is particularly notable, upwards of 50% inflation over the last 5 years. If you don't adjust for inflation, in short, what you can end up doing is increasing your emissions by 50%. Not because the product has changed or has got more climate intensive, just because it's got more expensive. So that's one of the main drawbacks of a spend-based methodology that doesn't have any inflation adjustments. Finally, then, looking at time relevance, we can see that HESCET, it's quite difficult actually to see where the methodology draws data from, but potentially some of those emissions factors are a number of years old. Whereas with Normative, we're quite transparent about which emissions factor, which database is used at any point, and we're updating our databases on a 6-month cadence. So as I said, we're about to update them this month. We'll have another update before the end of the year as well. Here is a really nice example. Dimitri and I have been working with a major higher education establishment in the UK. And when we looked at the calculations done by HESCET and then ran the same data through our system, we find that the emissions from Normative were much lower than they were from HESCET. We were thrown by this, to be honest. We went and double-checked, triple-checked our data to make sure that there wasn't a mistake, that we didn't have a big gap in the data that was provided to us. But what we found actually was that our data that we were collecting was more comprehensive even than the data that was previously recorded. Essentially, and Dimitri is going to talk about this in a moment, we found that in almost all cases, the HESCET methodology was overestimating emissions. And we'll go on to talk about why this is a major risk. But in summary, being overly cautious is a massive risk for a higher education establishment. And if you go on to the next couple of, we can see that the risk here is, again, unintentional greenwashing. It means as well that in the future, any reductions claims that you make can be masked by methodology improvements. If you're overestimating your emissions by 4 or 5 times where they should be, it can be really easy to make yourself seem like you've reduced emissions by 20%, but you haven't done anything differently with your operations. All you've done is changed to a new methodology. It's also really difficult whenever you're managing data to identify good practices. So when has a product made a big difference? But if your emissions are already widely overestimated, you won't really get any refinement in those changes between one product and another. Everything's been masked. And at the very end, we really worry that this leads to some organizations being open to claims of unintentional greenwashing. You're definitely not trying to greenwash, but you're overestimating your emissions. You're being too cautious and too relaxed about the data that you're reporting, and it can lead to claims in the future that you weren't being accurate actually with the reports. With this, I'll pass over to Dimitri.
Thank you, Johnny. Just to build up upon it, we have anonymized the data here, just to show you a case study of how Normative compares to the HESCET methodology, quite in depth to understand why that is, comparing both methodology, but also the actual emissions. So what you see here, to begin with, we have a comparison based on the 10 meta categories of the HESCET reportings. Basically, what we're able to do is we took the HESCET procurement codes, we're able to map it along with the HESCET categories, and then we have to map it to our taxonomy to get that comparison. So we can see here is those 10 categories. In orange, is you see the normative data results, and in blue, you see the HESCET ones. As Johnny mentioned, the spend that we take is actually the same, but it's different. So we'll go in more depth in the next few slides, is the granularity of emission factors applied, the coverage in itself, but also things like inflation adjustment. But the actual data, the underlying spend is exactly the same. Now, and we're going to see here, we're going to focus on things like medical and precision instruments, which is a really big difference, as well as construction and business services. But let's jump into specifics. We do love a waterfall chart because we think it paints a picture quite clearly in the comparison. But in the beginning, we can see here the HESCET results, and on the far right side, we can see the normative. We can see almost 400,000 tons of difference between the two. Now, what we see here is on red is where the difference comes from. So really big one we saw is medical and precision instruments. A lot of universities have a lot of research and labs, requires a lot of equipment, it's very expensive equipment. And that, because of that granularity, we see where the emissions come from. The same for the business services, as well as information and communication. So that's the difference between the two. But let's jump into the actual emissions to see in more detail. And we'll start first with medical precision instruments. As we say here, we have almost over 200,000 tons. So the HESCET methodology mapped as 237,000 tons of CO2 equivalent compared to normative, which is almost 22,000 tons. Now, a reason for that is, first of all, is the emission range. We see here from HESCET, the emission range comes from 0.42 kilos of CO2 equivalent all the way to almost 2.6. So it's a really big range compared to the normative one, which goes from like 0.04 all the way to 0.51. But also, just to build up on it, it's not just about the range, but it's also about the coverage. As we said, with normative, you have over 325,000 variations. So just to give you an example, for medical instruments here, HESCET applied 7 different emission factors. Compared to normative, we applied more than 30 different emission factors. And on top of that, within that 30, you have variations of country as well as inflation. So there you have a lot more. Compared to HESCET, it's just one worldwide emission factor, no matter where you bought this, where your supplier is based, where you bought this equipment. On top of that, because HESCET is quite rigid as methodology, a lot of times takes the worst case scenario. For example, an MRI, as we said, that might be manufactured in Asia or compared to, let's say, Europe, where the energy might be different, it will be exactly the same. So you don't see that variation. Compared to the us, we have country-specific, inflation-adjusted emission factors that gets updated constantly. And a lot of times here, what we saw, we can put specialized emission factors for the equipment and different services, which compare to the HESCET one. But this is just one example. Let's see another one. From there, we also have business services. And here we see around 76,000 tons of CO2 equivalent difference. Again, the emission factor range is not as big compared to medical instruments, but still quite significant, as we see here. But the important thing is to understand, again, how many emission factors applied. HESCET put 21 emission factors, compared to normative, we put 39, almost double the emission factor in here. But of course, from that, it's really important to understand what we put. So in here, for business services, HESCET has things like live entertainment, house maintenance, and even zoological gardens and mobile phone, which for us was quite strange to see zoological gardens as an activity for a higher education. Compared to our side, again, as I said before, more than twice the emission factors, and within that we have different variants, like country variants, but also on that we can put more specific emission factors for specific type of services, but also is that location. As we said, you buy something like, say, from China compared to Europe with very different emission factor there because of the energy and others. And of course, you have inflation. And finally, you start seeing a pattern here. We have the same thing with construction. As you guys grow and you build more, maybe facilities, this is also a really important area. So we can see here around 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalent difference. Again, the emission factor range is not as big again compared to the medical instrument, but still there is quite a gap there. The coverage, we see this is repeating. HESCET has 2 different emission factors. Compared to us, we have 12, so 6 times more emission factors coverage here. Also, in here, what was quite interesting, the emission factors that we had include things like paint, wallpaper, timber, and housing payment services, things which is maybe not the most accurate for a construction project. So in here, as before, we can go a lot more specific when it comes to emission factor coverage or what type of services you buy to have that construction achieved. And of course, on top of this, country variation, emission factor. I think you catch my drift. There's a repeating pattern here of how it works. And we talked in the beginning, reduction is really important. And of course, we want to understand like what has done because of the methodological changes compared to actual reduction activities, yourselves, your colleagues, actually taking action of making changes in your operations, your day-to-day things. So first, we see here, we see the HESCET calculated, and then the second column, we see what is the difference just methodology. So we see here almost 400,000 tons comes not from operation changes, but just methodological. So in here, it's really important to understand the actual mission, because once you've done this, you can start talking about, like, okay, what can we do? Reduction might be working with suppliers that take themselves action. Maybe they have SBTI targets, as we talked in the beginning. So them taking action to reduce the emissions actively rather than just methodological changes. From them, of course, a lot of things can be about continuing improving the activity data, right? You might have area for your electricity compared to kilowatt hour consumption. All those things is very normal. Towards the path to net zero, education and improvement data is a really big factor. And of course, finally, working with your colleagues and your students, work on the engagement, because education and sharing best practice on what you can do to reduce from the very simple things, like how you reduce your energy consumption in the labs with best practice, right? Decreasing maybe a few degrees on the fridges are very things that can really reduce your emissions. And that is how we see carbon accounting impact the day-to-day work without disturbing your operations, but just benefiting them. And of course, finally, with that being said, once all this done, you have the amazing results of having achieved your net zero target. For reference, net zero is like you need to achieve minimum 90% reduction from your base year. And of course, you can always invest to carbon offsets for any unavoidable emissions. But here, the really important thing is reductions. And that's why you need methodology that can really support that. With that being said, I'll go back to this because I think it paints a really nice picture. It is absolutely fine to have spend data. It's actually like, it's where you need to start to understand, like, where's my hotspot areas? Where can I put that impact vs effort? Because it's a lot of times it will be impossible to go all the way directly to product-specific data. So it's important to understand with spend and then slowly transition to activity data, like the kilos of maybe materials you bought for your labs, or the kilowatt hour consumption consumed for your electricity, or the distance travel for your business travel. Also from them, we can start transitioning to supply specific. Let's say we bought service. Rather having this spend, we can start engaging with a supplier to give us the emissions for the service, because different service providers will have different emission intensity because of how they provide the service to customers. And finally, especially with big equipment, you get product specific. And here, of course, it's very detailed, very specific, and it's really good to understand, like, new products and how much impact can have to your own emissions. And of course, in here, we can always do hybrid. Hybrid is a key thing. And of course, we're here to support, and we work, as I said, with higher education organizations to give them, like, where do we need to focus first? Of course, for SMEs, it would be hard to go the straight supply specific. So it's a lot of also education from the other side, working with your value chain, which we support a lot of organizations. But let me recap about Normative for higher education. How it works is, first of all, the methodology. We align with the greenhouse gas protocol. It's a standardized, and supports you if you have to go audits, or you have to, like, report to regulators. You have that backbone of scientific integrity to support you. From that, allows you to improve data. As we said, you can start with spend, which is absolutely fine, but then it's imperative to transition to more accurate data, like activity data, supply specific and product specific data. And finally, because you have that scientific integrity, you are fully auditable and transparent. So you also de-risking that part of, like, potential unintentional greenwashing or, like, inaccuracy methodology that people can call you out. So auditability is a really important thing. From the emission factor description, we saw the difference between Normative and HESCET. HESCET has one main database, as we have stability engineers that keep on updating. Right now we have more than 17 different databases, core databases. Also, everything is inflation adjustments, especially with spend. This is really key, because service you bought today compared to maybe like 2 years ago, the inflation, it will be much higher. As a result, your emissions will increase as well. So inflation is key. And of course, we're continuing following the latest industry updates, both in terms of methodology, but also in terms of support we give to our customers. So you get both of those expertise. Finally, it's really important methodology to support your reductions. What is the point of having just to report if you cannot take actions to it? Because that not only supports you with getting better like story out that you're working towards reducing your emissions, but it also can really improve the operations, right? Improve the efficiency, reducing costs. So you really need to understand first where the data comes, to be able to allow you to make that data-driven decisions. Of course, this will be through first better data. From there, it's really important to work with your value chain. Start working with your top suppliers, have those discussions, those educations. So supply engagement is crucial. And finally, it's all about, once we have the data, how can we use it to reduction tools? And this, of course, can be also with educating internally, right? If you don't visualize something, how can you reduce it? So that is key of allowing yourselves and your colleagues to really own their missions in order to take action and use this as a leverage to reduce. And finally, communication. We talk a lot, but engagement is key. You have always an expert advice, myself or Johnny, as an example. We have a quite big team here, Normative. We also support with education. You have a technical process and educated communication with your students and your facility. And of course, which is where we started, is no fear of greenwashing. This is really important. With that being said, well, let's see also what Normative supports higher education reporting. And I give it back to Johnny.
Yeah, thanks, Dimitri. Conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these last few slides quite briefly, but I think it's useful for us just to remember the key points that we've talked about today. So, in the next slide. When it comes to HESCET reporting, we've mapped the PROC HE codes to our taxonomy, which means it's much easier to report straightforward in a straightforward manner. You don't have to do any additional mapping yourselves. The same data that you were putting into the HESCET calculator, you can give to Normative, and we can do all of the same categorization and reporting. For example, in the 10 meta categories that were previously accessible to you using the HESCET calculator, we will provide that to you as well. And crucially, and I think what we found from trying to investigate the HESCET data ourselves, the normative data is fully auditable and transparent. So anyone can come in and see straight away which emissions factor has been used on which activity, which database was referenced, and any transformations that have been done to that data. Any conversions, any inflation adjustments, you can see exactly what's been done, either in-app, in normative, or in an export spreadsheet that is really useful for auditors. So I would say if you plan to do assurance or third-party auditing, it's really crucial that you step up and use a reporting methodology such as normatives. The next slide, yeah, just briefly talking about student travel. It's a good question as to where student travel actually fits in the greenhouse gas protocol. We have a lot of discussions internally about this, but we recognize that it's really important for universities. So number one, we will help you to collect student travel information. We will help you to understand exactly where that goes in your reporting. We will keep it distinct from the other data just to make sure that you're fully aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol, but we will allow you to report separately. So you can report officially under scope 1, 2, and 3, but in addition to that, you can have a separate student travel data footprint that will allow you to report what were the emissions related to student travel. And finally, we talk about employee engagement. We're well aware that for students, for universities, students are really important stakeholders. And so we have a service that can be tailored specifically to engaging with your students to help your university really stand out as climate experts. Finally, this is our summary of the information that we've just shared across today. We really think that normative is tailored and is a really great fit for higher education establishments. And with this, we'll go to the next slide. If you're really interested, we have a white paper that we can share out along with this webinar. You'll find it on our website, normative.io. It's got a lot more information in terms of the methodology and the ins and outs of why normative is best placed for higher education. I think with that, we can move on to the next slide. We're about on time now, but I think let's try to get even a couple of questions in here. Even if we have to go over, we can go over for a few minutes.
Johnny, Dimitris, thank you for that presentation case study. That was really insightful. So let's see if we have any questions in our inbox. So thank you guys for attending. We've got one question here. You mentioned that you can support with the HESCET reporting requirements. How does that work in practice? So who wants to take that?
I can take that. So what we would do is we take all your spend. If you start with spend, normally they tend to be combined, attached with your procurement, higher education codes. What we did here from our side, we have mapped all of those things to those HESCET 10 meta categories. So that when you ingest the data into the normative platform, you automatically are going to have something like filters. We call it dimensions. So when you go into the platform, you'll be able to see your emissions, not just based on the greenhouse gas protocol, but also based on those HESCET reporting requirements, as we saw in the case study, by medical and instruments, by construction, by business activities, etc. On top of that, and that's the really cool thing with the normative platform, is you can add also other filters you might want. So that could be maybe by department, but it could be by different facilities, whatever it might be. So you have ownership of your data. So when we talk about reductions and leveraging them, you can have those views and custom footprints to support your decision making.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Dimitris. Another question here. This looks like a lot of work and resource heavy compared to our current solution. Where do we start and how many resources does such an exercise require?
Yeah, I can take that one. I absolutely don't want to make it seem like a lot more work at the base level. And when we talked earlier about spend being a good base across both HESCET and normative, it's the same level of work. So the same data that you were inputting previously to HESCET, you can provide that to normative. What we would argue is you're losing then the need to go into the HESCET calculator to fix any broken cells, to check the formula. We do that on your behalf. We're also updating the databases more often, as you say. So you're losing actually a lot of the admin that you were previously doing managing the HESCET system. If anyone was ever asking you, oh, how was this calculated? We're making it a lot easier actually by having it within normative. You'll be able to see, if you request a demo, you'll be able to see exactly how transparent normative it is. So I'd say at the spend level, it's equal to or actually less work than you've done before. And then really what we'll be trying to do is work with you in a pragmatic way to start gathering activity data where available, but also looking at supplier specific data. And so we're really excited. We've got the network, the carbon network at normative, that's full of suppliers, and the biggest suppliers from around the world, like some of the biggest tech companies, the biggest manufacturers. We have their data in our system already. And so whenever you try to connect with suppliers, that will be quite streamlined as well, that you're able to just use data that's in there already. Plus, if you want to start reaching out to more of your own suppliers, we find a way to try to make that as easy and as practical as possible for you. I think that's the answer to the question, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you, Johnny. And with that, I think that closes up our session today. We're up to that time. I want to say firstly, a special thank you to both of you guys, Johnny, Dimitris. Thank you for presenting this half-an-hour special with our audience today. To all of our attendees today, I want to say a special thank you. If you have any further questions, please reach out to our team here. As mentioned, our climate strategy team is industry leading within the market. They'll be happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to request a demo as well on our website, and feel free to add us on LinkedIn as well. And with that, I thank you, all the team. Until next time, thank you. Bye.